There is an enormous 80-ton solid volcanic monolith sitting on a remote Pacific coastline right now that, according to advanced 3D physics simulations and a full-scale replica test, was never dragged on wooden sleds and never rolled on logs by thousands of slaves. It moved entirely upright, shifted gently from side to side by a small handful of people with handmade ropes, stepping across the dirt like a massive, impossibly heavy refrigerator being carefully coaxed across a kitchen floor. This single mechanical truth shatters almost everything we are taught about ancient history, and it opens the door to a much darker, far more fascinating question. How did radically isolated civilizations, separated by massive oceans and thousands of years with zero contact, independently construct the heaviest, most mathematically precise megaliths on the planet? They did this without diesel engines, without hydraulic cranes, without structural steel, and without a single written equation explaining the physics they were intuitively manipulating. The actual answer is not aliens, and it is not blind brute force. It involves a staggering amount of human coordination that modern society has completely forgotten how to replicate. So let us systematically break down exactly how these impossible structures were actually built, piece by piece, because the absolute truth involves the exact molecular properties of poured water, a relentless modern architect who cracked a millennia-old mystery using only basic software, and a gigantic stone guardian that scientifically, genuinely walked to its final destination. Let us begin with the most heavily debated construction site in human existence, because it establishes the baseline for every single impossible feat that follows, the Great Pyramid of Giza. Let us begin with the single most heavily debated construction site in human existence, because it establishes the baseline for every impossible feat that follows, the Great Pyramid of Giza. The mathematical scale of this structure should genuinely terrify modern engineers. We are talking about more than 2.3 million individual stone blocks. Some of these stones weigh up to 90 tons, and they were stacked with absolute structural precision without a single iron tool, without the wheel and load-bearing use, and without any hydraulic lifting machinery. It has survived wars, sandstorms, earthquakes, and thousands of years of grinding time, considerably better than most steel and concrete skyscrapers built just a century ago. But before we explain the physics, we have to kill a massive historical lie. The popular image of millions of enslaved laborers toiling endlessly under the crack of a whip is largely a myth. It is a Hollywood hallucination that completely collapses under modern archaeological scrutiny. Ancient daily logbooks written on papyrus reveal something much more intimidating than forced labor. They reveal a hyper-efficient, highly organized supply chain. The project actually relied on roughly 4,000 primary skilled masons. These were the elite workers carefully shaping and placing the stone. They were backed by a massive secondary workforce of 16,000 to 20,000 people who managed the temporary ramps, manufactured the tools, and supplied the food and fuel. Over 4,500 years ago, without a single laptop or modern project management software, they ran a centralized logistics operation that successfully fed, housed, and directed tens of thousands of people toward one unified goal for decades. They did not rely on brutal oppression. They possessed a flawless, scalable chain of command that worked perfectly. But knowing exactly how many people stood in the desert does not explain the mechanical nightmare of the actual construction. How do you physically lift solid stone blocks the weight of multiple modern cars directly into the sky? For decades, historians lazily assumed the builders just dragged these massive blocks up a single colossal straight ramp on the exterior. But mathematically, that theory is a catastrophic failure. A ramp long enough and structurally stable enough to reach that towering peak would actually require significantly more raw stone and human labor than the pyramid itself. Furthermore, zero archaeological evidence of such a massive temporary structure has ever been uncovered anywhere in the surrounding desert. This is where a French architect named Jean-Pierre Houdin enters the story, and his obsession with this mechanical nightmare borders on brilliant madness. In 1999, Houdin completely abandoned his comfortable, stable career. He isolated himself, spending years working with early 3D CAD modeling software, attempting to reverse engineer the 4,000-year-old riddle completely from scratch. He faced extreme professional skepticism from traditional academics, but his computer model proved something the historians entirely missed. The ramp was not outside. It was built directly into the DNA of the pyramid itself. Houdin's now widely respected internal ramp theory suggests the Egyptians used a conventional exterior ramp for only the first 30% of the base. For everything above that, they transitioned entirely to a spiraling internal corridor winding continuously upward inside the solid core of the structure. Crucially, this elegant architectural model explains the greatest missing piece of the archaeological record. As the pyramid grew higher, the stones from the lower external ramp were deliberately dismantled, hauled upward through the spiral, and permanently repurposed into the upper tiers. They left absolutely nothing behind on the landscape for future archaeologists to discover. But before a stone ever touched a ramp, it had to reach the construction zone. In 2012, researchers deciphered an ancient papyrus, revealing a massive logistical shortcut. Ancient engineers utilized long-lost, shifting branches of the Nile River to transport these heavy monoliths practically to the doorstep of the site. They let the river itself quietly absorb the heaviest burden before human muscle ever needed to take over. But even with river logistics and internal spirals, how do you drag multiple tons of solid rock across the brutal grinding friction of dry desert ground? That brings us to a detail hiding in plain sight within ancient Egyptian art. A detail that looks like magic, but is actually pure, undeniable physics. Ancient Egyptian wall paintings clearly depict workers walking in front of massive stone sledges, pouring water directly onto the sand. For a very long time, traditional Egyptologists assumed this was simply ceremonial, a superstitious ritual meant to bless the ground, or a symbolic gesture with zero mechanical value. It wasn't a ritual. It was applied granular physics. When you wet dry desert sand with exactly the right amount of water, it completely changes the mechanical properties of the ground. The moisture creates a thin, stabilizing film of water tension between the individual sand grains. This microscopic bridging locks the sand together, transforming a shifting, grinding surface into a smooth, rigid track. This simple action dramatically reduces the friction coefficient a sledge experiences as it is dragged forward. In fact, it cuts the required pulling force by roughly half. The ancient Egyptians did not just accidentally spill water. Through patient generational trial and error, they had perfectly reverse-engineered a verifiable principle of fluid and granular physics, something modern scientists would not formally measure and publish in peer-reviewed journals for another 4,000 years. But to see just how universal this intuitive physics really was, we have to leave the desert, cross an ocean, and step onto a damp, windswept plain in southern England. Erected around 2500 BC, Stonehenge presents a genuinely different flavor of the exact same mechanical nightmare. You are looking at a precise circular formation of massive stones, some weighing up to 30 tons individually. But the truly baffling part of Stonehenge is not the final assembly. It is the transportation that came before it. Isotope analysis proves that some of these massive pillars, the blue stones, originated from quarries in the Preseli Hills of Wales. That is nearly 200 miles away from the final construction site. How do you move multi-ton boulders across 200 miles of rugged, ancient British terrain without wheeled vehicles or heavy draft animals? The accepted answer is a highly coordinated hybrid transportation system. Ancient engineers utilized sledges and wooden rollers to drag the stones overland in slow, agonizing stages, but whenever they reached a waterway, they transferred that crushing weight onto rafts. Water is remarkably efficient at supporting enormous mass with nearly zero friction. It is a universal mechanical cheat code that almost every ancient culture independently discovered. Once these stones finally arrived, the builders did not fight gravity head-on with raw brute force to stand them upright. They used sustained leverage. By placing precise counterweights and establishing a mechanical pivot, a coordinated team could slowly rock a 30-ton pillar from a horizontal resting position into a fully vertical one, inch by careful inch. They broke an impossible lift into a long, manageable sequence of genuinely achievable steps. But here is where we must stop and admit something that modern science absolutely hates admitting. It is incredibly easy to look at these theories and confidently declare that we have ancient history completely figured out. We can mathematically explain sliding 2-ton blocks using the granular physics of wet sand. We can perfectly demonstrate tilting 30-ton pillars upright using sustained leverage. But how exactly did ancient builders hoist 90-ton solid granite beams 150 feet directly up into the king's chamber of the Great Pyramid? Wet sand does not explain vertical lifting. A rocking pivot does not explain suspending 90 tons in midair. Even the most brilliant internal ramp theories buckle under the sheer mechanical force required for that specific payload. We are still missing a massive, deeply uncomfortable piece of the puzzle. There are missing variables in our historical physics that we simply do not possess yet. However, there is one ancient mystery we finally did solve. Because what happens when you do not have rivers for transport, you do not have flat ground for sledges, and you have to move an 80-ton volcanic monolith across a rough, mountainous landscape? You do not drag it, you make the stone walk. Which brings us directly to Easter Island, and to what might be the single most deeply satisfying solved mystery in the entire history of ancient engineering. It is satisfying precisely because the absolute truth was hiding in plain sight for centuries, locked inside a local oral tradition. Modern scientists only recently caught up to a mechanical reality that the islanders themselves had been stating confidently all along. For generations, academic researchers debated endlessly how the Rapa Nui people managed to transport their massive Moai statues. We are talking about solid volcanic monoliths weighing up to 80 tons individually, moved from a central quarry to ceremonial platforms scattered across the outer edges of the island. The leading academic theories were predictable. They assumed horizontal transport, dragging the statues flat on wooden sledges or rolling them continuously over logs. It was the exact same brute force approach documented in other ancient construction projects worldwide. But there was a massive, persistent problem with this assumption. The roads themselves told a different story. Archaeological surveys of the actual transport routes consistently found absolutely nothing. There were no preserved trackways. There were no depressions worn into the earth from heavy log rollers. There were no deep sledge marks scarring the underlying bedrock. If you repeatedly drag 80-ton stones along the exact same dirt paths for years, you leave catastrophic physical damage behind, but the landscape was completely clean. Meanwhile, the Rapa Nui oral tradition had been insisting on something entirely different, a narrative that outside researchers had dismissed for decades as charming, primitive folklore. The statues, according to the islanders, simply walked to their destinations. In 2025, a landmark study led by anthropologists Carl Lipo and Terry Hunt finally stopped treating this oral history as a myth and started treating it as a literal, testable scientific hypothesis. They deployed advanced physics modeling, detailed 3D scanning, and rigorous field experimentation, and their findings completely dismantled decades of academic arrogance. By analyzing nearly 1,000 individual Moai statues across the island, they discovered a startling pattern. The statues that were successfully transported shared a very specific, standardized set of anatomical features. They possessed a wide, clearly defined D-shaped base and a deliberate forward lean measuring exactly between 5 and 15 degrees off true vertical. These were not artistic choices. They were not stylistic preferences made by ancient sculptors. This was functional engineering. These exact dimensions were carefully built into the physical shape of the monolith specifically to manipulate its center of gravity. Here is the exact mechanical process. By attaching sturdy handmade ropes to the upper sections of a fully upright moai, a coordinated human team could pull rhythmically from alternating sides. This caused the incredibly heavy statue to rock steadily from edge to edge. Because of that deliberate forward lean, every single rocking motion caused the rounded front edge of the base to act as a natural pivot point. It efficiently translated side-to-side rocking energy directly into forward momentum, one pivot at a time. The statue genuinely mechanically walked across the landscape. It is the exact same underlying physics you intuitively use when you need to move a massive, impossibly heavy refrigerator across a kitchen floor. You do not exhaust yourself trying to drag the entire dead weight flat across the tiles. You rock it deliberately from corner to corner, letting gravity and leverage do the hardest work for you. But the researchers did not stop at computer models. They went out and physically proved it. They constructed a full-scale 4.35-ton concrete replica moai, incorporating the exact forward-leaning center of gravity identified in the ancient statues. Using only 18 people working in rhythmic coordination, they successfully walked that replica 100 meters in roughly 40 minutes. Once the initial highly strenuous rocking motion was established, pendulum dynamics essentially took over. The momentum became self-sustaining. Calculations showed an average-sized moai could realistically walk over 1,000 feet per hour. Suddenly, the entire archaeological landscape made perfect sense. Even the ancient transport roads were custom-engineered for this exact method. They were consistently built to be about 4.5 meters wide, and crucially, they featured a gently concave cross-section. A concave road is a terrible surface for dragging a flat sledge. But it is the absolute perfect shape to stabilize a tall, upright, rocking statue, preventing it from accidentally toppling over sideways mid-step. And what about the statues that never made it? The ones found abandoned and shattered along the transport routes? For decades, early skeptics pointed to these fallen monoliths as definitive proof that the walking theory was false. But when analyzed properly in context, they proved the exact opposite. Researchers mapped the locations of the abandoned statues and found a striking correlation. Roughly half of all the fallen moai were located within just 2 kilometers of the original quarry site. As the distance from the quarry increased, the frequency of abandoned statues steadily plummeted. This is not a mystical pattern. It is the exact statistical distribution of mechanical failure. The Rapa Nui did not intentionally abandon these statues for religious reasons. When an 80-ton monolith accidentally lost its balance on a difficult stretch of road and violently tipped over, it was often structurally compromised or completely impossible to stand back up. It was a failed transport attempt. They simply left the broken stone exactly where it fell, walked back to the quarry, and patiently carved another one. When you pull back and look at the Great Pyramid, Stonehenge, and Easter Island together, a deeply uncomfortable pattern emerges about our modern world. Despite originating from completely isolated cultures, separated by massive oceans and thousands of years, they all solved catastrophic engineering problems using the exact same mechanical cheat codes. None of them possessed the wheel for heavy transport. None of them forged iron tools to cut stone. None of them had diesel engines or hydraulic power. Yet every single one of them independently realized that you must reduce friction, manipulate gravity, and break a massive vertical lift into a manageable sequence of small horizontal steps. They possessed a terrifyingly accurate grasp of intuitive physics that never required a peer-reviewed scientific paper to function flawlessly. But here's the most important truth. None of this required modern technology. It required something our generation has almost entirely lost. We look back at ancient civilizations and casually dismiss them as primitive or uneducated. We assume we are vastly superior because we hold supercomputers in our pockets. But we have sacrificed the exact mechanism that built those timeless structures. We have traded collective unity for modern isolation. Their absolute greatest piece of technology was not a lever, a sledge, or a poured bucket of water. It was intergenerational purpose. It was the ability of an entire society to organize thousands of individual minds around one singular unified goal and to sustain that systemic coordination for decades. They built for a future they knew they would never live to see. In our hyper-individualized, fragmented modern world, we struggle to sustain focus on a shared objective for more than a few days. We have infinite information but zero collective patience. The next time you look at a photograph of a towering pyramid in the Egyptian desert, or a massive stone guardian facing the Pacific Ocean, do not look for aliens. Do not look for magic or supernatural intervention. Recognize it for what it actually is. It is the ultimate monument to human willpower. They built the impossible out of nothing but dirt, water, rope, and the absolute refusal to quit. Moving forward, inch by inch, one patient, rocking step at a time,